everybody, and welcome back to Project HR, where we are dedicated to helping you build a better workplace. Project HR is brought to you by IRI Consultants. IRI empowers leaders to prevent and solve mission-critical workforce issues through holistic and sustainable strategies. For more information, you can visit IRI at iriconsultants.com. I am Jennifer Oraqua, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for this episode of Project HR. In today's increasingly competitive recruiting landscape, companies are redefining what an ideal candidate looks like. With remote work, geography is no longer a hiring barrier. But what other factors might also be shifting as companies across the globe seek to diversify and find skilled talent in unlikely places? In this episode, I'm talking with Gil Winch, the founder of CY, an outsourcing services call center. You may have heard his 2020 TED Talk, How to Find Hidden Potential. Gil is also the author of Winning with Underdogs, How Hiring the Least Likely Candidates Can Spark Creativity, Improve Service, and Boost Profits for Your Business. Gil, thank you so much for joining me on Project HR.
My pleasure, Jennifer.
So, Gil, let's talk a little bit about your background. Your career is definitely interesting, even before your latest interests.
I started out as a clinical psychologist, which I found very, very interesting theoretically. But when I found myself sitting in front of patients hours every day, I found myself much more inclined to consult them and tell them what they should be doing and how they can try and alleviate their suffering with a much more proactive attitude. And some of my patients really needed. They needed something much more slower.
Hmm.
And I realized that clinical psychology isn't exactly the right niche for me. And I did a PhD in organizational psychology, which is right up my alley,
Hmm.
because then I actually get to tell people what I think they should be doing. And I did that with a very big variation of companies and skills within companies for about 20 years until I put it all aside to start building and researching CY.
So, how did you first learn about the challenges facing unemployed disabled people?
When I hit 40, I was looking for something social I could have a significant contribution to. And because we're just a regular family, it couldn't be something with philanthropy. I just don't have enough to give to make a significant contribution. I knew it was something that I had to do by doing. And 2 weeks after I was looking around, I met a friend who's paraplegic. And he said, "Do you know that about 80% of the severely disabled people in the world are totally out of a job, maybe even 90%, and even most people with just regular disabilities are also out of a job." And I just said, no, I didn't know. And I just went home because when you think about it for a second, severely disabled people not working, it sort of makes common sense.
Mm.
So I didn't spend too much time thinking about it until later on that evening, it hit me, and I just looked up quickly. Who are these severely disabled people who are chronically unemployed all over the world? And it turns out that there's no good explanation.
Hmm.
I'll explain what I mean. When I started talking to people with severe disabilities, do you know what I found out? Jennifer, they're all sitting at home using screens and computers,
Mm. Hmm.
and that's what most people do at work all day. So it just didn't make sense why people who are doing the same kind of function at their home, why are they so globally unemployed? So that's what sort of like there was a mystery there, and the mystery sort of sucked me in, and that's what got me into it.
So, through that understanding, you also learned about how other unemployed, like marginalized populations, are struggling as well. So what populations are we talking about here?
Well, there are some populations that are globally unemployed. I think the 1 billion people with disabilities are the largest, probably. But also, for instance, ex cons everywhere are unemployed. And those are maybe the two most common globally unemployed populations. But every specific country has its own immigrants, its own religious minorities. Um, so they are different for every country. I would also probably say that QLGBT people probably don't get a fair shake in most places, but they are employed, but not as much maybe as they should be. And amongst the employed women, for instance, the global gender wage parity is 34%. So and that's huge if you think about it.
Hmm.
It's in double figures in the US as well.
Hmm.
So there are an awful lot of populations that either not employed or when they are employed, they're not getting a fair shake. And when you do the math, it's most of the world. It's women. It's people with disabilities. They're 15% of the world.
Mhm.
So really, most of us aren't getting a fair shake or not getting to go into the workplace. And I thought that's something I can actually try and address.
Yeah, and you found that knowledge inspirational, and you started your company CY, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But it also inspired you to write your book, Winning with Underdogs. Why write this book now?
Well, I thought that if I build the company and I built it as a showcase, that showcase will be powerful enough to change the world regarding the inclusion of people with disabilities and other underdogs in the workplace. And after 10 years of operations, we had 70 countries send people over to see what we were doing. The academia did a few studies about us. We were written about in a few books.
Mm,
And after 10 years, I looked around and truly nothing had changed.
mm,
And I realized that we are using a really, really specific managerial model that I developed 5 years prior to opening CY, and that without that unique knowledge, nobody else will actually be successful enough hiring underdogs generally and people with disabilities and maybe a few other populations specifically.
mm,
So I decided I have to get that knowledge out there. And the only way to get it out there is to write a book in English.
mhm.
And that's why I wrote it. It's our playbook and it needs to get out.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Gil, I've got to take a quick sponsorship break right now, but when we return, I want to talk about what it means for a company to embrace full inclusion. Stay with us.
Is your HR team prepared for union organizing? The NLRB has reported a 57% increase in union petitions for the first half of this year. If your team isn't prepared to respond, your company may find itself ill-equipped to maintain a direct connection with employees. Union-Proof certification is e-learning that delivers the labor relations knowledge and confidence your team needs. No longer will you struggle with NLRB processes and procedures, union terms, or what's the best course of action. Prepare your team to work with attorneys and consultants and to be aware of employee rights and the company's responsibilities. Union-Proof certification was designed specifically for busy HR and labor professionals who want to ensure they are prepared for anything the current labor environment brings. To learn more or to enroll, visit projectionsinc.com/certification.
We're back here on Project HR with Gil Winch, founder of CY and author of Winning with Underdogs. Now, Gil, in your book, you discuss the problematic nature of the term inclusion. What do you mean by it being problematic?
It's really, really problematic if you think about it, because imagine that workplaces are filled with mainstream people and you have like these large groups of people outside. Inclusion means let's start letting them in. So when you start letting in a certain group, you're still leaving a hell of a lot of people outside.
Mm,
And I don't think there is such a thing as inclusion. Either you don't have a bouncer at your gates, or you do. And if you do, you're not inclusive. The fact that you're letting in a bit few more people or a few more groups than you previously were doesn't make you inclusive. It just makes you less biased, right? If I'm stealing from a bunch of people, but I stop stealing from some of them, it doesn't not make me a thief. And
right.
if I'm closing my gates to various people just because they belong to a group,
Mm,
I'm not inclusive, even if I'm letting more people in than I used to.
mhm.
So I don't get the inclusive thing. I think either no bouncer, our gates are open, everyone gets a fair shake just on their own merits, disregarding the group they belong to, or not. And currently, the world is at a not place in most places.
So, is that what it means for a company to work with full inclusion?
Yes, for me, full inclusion means we will do everything we can to judge people solely on their merits alone. And we will disregard their preferences, their looks, their gender, I mean, in screening, for instance, in a survey showed that about 50% of interviewers thought that if people don't make good eye contact with them, they'll fail them. They can even fail them. I mean, large percentages of them will fail people just from how they walk or enter the door.
Mm,
And that's because most businesses are set up to look for mainstream people.
mm,
There is this sort of below the senses or very gentle understanding of who we like to hire and who we
Mm-hmm.
like to see around here and
Mm-hmm.
who our superiors like to see around here. Otherwise, there's really no good explanation of how you can actually leave so many people out
Mm-hmm.
consistently.
So, what are the barriers to working with full inclusion? I mean, we've talked a little bit about human bias. Is it problems with the traditional hiring process? Is it a combination of the two?
Actually, there are quite a lot of barriers. I think, first of all, companies are very, very motivated to strive for maximum profit. Now, when you have people outside the workforce or who haven't worked, and if we have any female listeners who had a bit of a longer pregnancy break and stayed at home for a half a year or a year or 2 years before they went back to work, they'll remember that they lost some confidence there. If you're out of work for a while, you start losing confidence, you start losing all sorts of things that you actually need in the workplace. And if you've never been in the workplace, or if you've always been secluded, then you won't be just like everybody else. You'll be somewhat traumatized. Your dependency will be bigger. You'll have a much harder time focusing for 8 or 9 hours
Mm,
consistently until you get used to it. You'll be much more timid and insecure. Your self efficacy will be lower, which means that you'll need a bit more effort and understanding and patience to get up to steam. Now, it doesn't mean that at the end you won't be overtaking people who are mainstream, but probably the beginning will be a bit more difficult.
mm,
And in a capitalistic economy where you need to report the next quarter how well you did, lots of senior people really don't have the patience to bring in people who are a bit slower, who ultimately will be better and stay longer, but will start out a bit slower when all focus is on the Excel of the next quarter. So, first of all, it needs realization that diversity doesn't only mean different people or different groups, but with the same capabilities. It also means you will bring on some people who start out slower, but you believe can catch up and catch up well, or people who might not even fully catch up, but they'll be your most loyal and engaged workers, and they'll be well worth their weight because they bring so much additional effort and spirit to your company.
mm,
It can often inspire the people around to actually do better. So,
mm,
diversity is not only opening the doors wide for everyone, it's also allowing for the fact that some people are going to need a different kind of start in order to catch up and get to where everyone else does
mhm,
in a regular fashion.
mhm. And I appreciate that you acknowledge that hiring candidates outside the mainstream can often require extra effort on the part of the employer. So, what kind of effort do we need to put forth? What are we talking about here?
You need to do pretty much everything different if you actually want to be diverse. It'll really pay off in the bottom line, and you'll get amazing employees and actually earn more money. But you
Mhm,
need to do things different. The job ads, the screening, the onboarding, the training, everything has to be different because there are large amounts of people, large groups that can't do well in the traditional way of doing things, which is not necessary really. So
mhm,
you have to do things differently. You have to be ready to adapt yourself to some of the needs of the people you want to bring in. CEOs have to be the ones driving this.
mm,
Because when you have someone below them who has specific targets to hit, any kind of noise or disturbance or non mainstream is going to move him away from the targets as he sees them. So they're not interested in doing that. Give me the people who can finish the course as quickly as can and help me reach my targets as quickly as can, even if they all leave quickly and I have to do it again, rather than give me a few people that I'll spend a bit more time with, but they'll stay for the long term.
sure.
So there's an awful lot of things to address in order to really enable companies to be diverse. It's just not only a question of them wanting to, it's how
Mhm.
much they really are willing to change things and put in effort to make it happen.
Yeah, for sure. And in your book, you talk about the financial benefits to an employer that sort of justifies these extra efforts. Can you talk about
Yeah.
that a little bit?
Social purpose is very highly correlated with employee engagement. And there's an awful lot of robust research regarding the financial benefits of employee engagement. Every important metric, financial metric, is in double figures for the
Mhm.
companies with highly engaged employees.
Mhm.
Attrition, sales, profits, productivity, they're all around 20%
Mhm.
higher, even sometimes more. And in lots of surveys and in lots of research, one after the other. Now imagine a company that can do 20% more of what it's doing with the same workforce,
Mhm.
or who can just change how they treat people and enlarge their profits by 20%.
Mhm.
I mean, if there was a computer that could do that, everybody would be buying it, right?
Mhm.
Those are large figures.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Gil, it's time for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Orqua, and my guest today is Gil Winch, founder of CY and author of Winning with Underdogs. I'm back. So, we've mentioned CY throughout this podcast. Let's talk a little bit about what CY is and your goals in starting the company.
Okay, CY was built as a showcase in order to prove that people with disabilities and other unemployed populations can reach proven regular productivity if we realize what they need in order to do so. And we decided to become a call center because that's the way to prove regular productivity. There will always be other companies and other teams doing exactly what we're doing, and you can always have a full apples to apples comparison. And we designated ourselves as a social business. We don't presume maximum profit. We're there to prove the point. And CY is my display case sort of thing to prove the point.
Mm-hmm.
And we have a few hundred employees. Two-thirds of employees, staff, and managers are severely disabled, and the other third are other populations. We have lots of ex-cons. Some people work for us while they're still in prison. Older people, about 20% of the company is over 60. Single parents, religious minorities, everybody who doesn't feel they can find a good place for them
Mm-hmm.
is invited to come and join us. And we built the company really in order to prove the point to government, to people with disabilities, to other employers, and basically to the world. And that's how
So,
we set out.
sure. So, what have your results been like?
It's the concept has worked magnificently insofar as we constantly bring people who have never succeeded before, not only to regular productivity, but everybody's that advanced in the company started out, as an unemployed disabled person or
Mm-hmm.
underdog. So it's not only that everybody's doing the rank and file job well, everybody's doing their job well, and that's everybody in the company pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
So that part of it is working well. Our model manages to bring pretty much everybody to proven regular productivity for regular wages, which is a
Mm-hmm.
wonderful thing. It just hasn't changed much. And as I mentioned before, that's the reason I wrote the book, just to get the knowledge out there, because there's a limit to how many people I'll be able to hire, and there are
Mm-hmm.
billion people with disabilities and many, many
Yeah.
other underdogs out there. So,
Well, and clearly you've established a framework that works there. Do you believe that any organization can become fully inclusive?
well, not only do I believe it, but because I've been in this space for a while now, I've met and been contacted by and had Zooms with wonderful companies from all over the world, which pretty much no one's heard about, doing wonderful things, fully diverse.
Mm.
For instance, in I think most countries want large companies to have between 3 to 6 or 7% people with disabilities by self-report, which is also always about twice as much as not by self-report.
Mhm.
Um, there's a wonderful hotel chain in India called Lemon Tree Hotels, who has 80 branches, and 21% of their employees are what they call opportunity deprived Indians.
Mm.
I think most of them are people with disabilities, but not only they have orphans there, they have anybody who really can't find a job. They do wonderful work, and it's 20 something percent of the company, and everyone in the company is so highly engaged with them doing that. And there
Mhm.
are other wonderful companies doing amazing work with many employees, and really with 10% or 50% of diversity, true diversity in their companies, or even more.
Mhm.
I don't know anyone else who has 100% like us, but there are many companies that do a wonderful job. But the
Mhm.
common denominator I found is that their owner is really into it
Mm-hmm.
from a value standpoint. And without someone really senior being really into it, it doesn't really happen.
Well, and you know that most of our audience here at Project HR are HR professionals. So what are the first steps an HR professional can take today to help their company embrace more underdog candidates?
Well, there's one concept which I think is really, really, really important. And I call it reserved employment for the opportunity deprived. And I'll explain it. It's a simple concept. It's just like reserved parking. The concept of reserved parking is that some people, if they park far away, don't have the option of entering the venue because they can't walk or traverse the distance. So we save some of the best parking spots for people who don't have an option to park further away. And it makes perfect sense to all of us, right? I mean, we all get upset if someone parks not disabled in a disabled parking spot or a reserved parking spot. Am I right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's like that. So let's look at exactly the same concept when it comes to the workplace. Certain populations have a real hard time finding work. I'll just give a couple of examples. People with hearing disabilities, because they can't communicate on phones, many of them, not all of them, and it's really limiting. So most of them are out of a job. Now, so many companies have chat teams, which is a good entry level job for people who want to enter the job market. If those companies would just, the HR people would say, let's keep a few of those positions in the chat teams for people with limited options because they have, for instance, excuse me, hearing disabilities, then you wouldn't have so many people with hearing disabilities out of a job. I think every population that's not working, you can find jobs that they can do for regular productivity and regular wages, but often those jobs just aren't available.
Mm-hmm.
So if HR people would scan their companies and paint a few jobs that are really good for specific populations that need that job, then you wouldn't have so many unemployed people.
All right, Gil, if our listeners want to find out more about you or your work with CI, where can we go?
Well, I'm not really good on social media, but I am on LinkedIn and I do respond to whoever reaches out.
Okay.
And it's easy to find me on LinkedIn. CY has a site. There's some of it in English, and you can. There's the site is in English also, and you can see how we go about some of the things. But
Mm-hmm.
I wrote Winning with Underdogs really in order to get our playbook out there so HR people can actually use it and see what we've been doing that
Mm-hmm.
enabled us to succeed with people who everyone else totally overlooked.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say something else. Giving is really addictive.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a happy addiction because I don't think there are many people who are as happy as I am at my work. I don't think there are many people who are surrounded as I am by love and inspiration when I go to work. And how many times in our lifetime do we have the opportunity to actually transform someone's life from isolation, poverty, and misery to the exact opposite? And
Mm-hmm.
anyone in HR has that privilege. And when you retire, you won't be telling your grandchildren when they ask you, Mommy or Daddy, what did you do at work? You won't be telling them about that wonderful bonus you got because you really hit targets well that year, or the praise you got for your manager on the whatever project you wrote a report on. You will be telling them about the person or persons whose lives you transformed because you gave them the right job, you supported them in it until they could do it well enough, and you actually saved their lives. And when you see the pride in your grandchildren's eyes, I think then you'll realize what's really important in this life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think anyone who has the opportunity to do such a thing, even for one person during your career, that's going to be the most powerful, wonderful feeling you'll ever
Mm-hmm.
have at work. And I would really encourage you not to miss out on that opportunity.
And again, links to Gil's book, along with links to his TED Talk, his personal website, as well as CY's website, will all be included in this week's episode companion, which you can grab for free at iriconsultants.com/podcast. Right now, though, Gil, it is time for our lightning round questions. These are questions I ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
Yes, I am.
All right, so our first question is always a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about winning with underdogs. In the book, you shared your passion for endurance running. In your opinion, which of these classic running films is better, Without Limits or Chariots of Fire?
I have to say Chariots of Fire because of the music. But the story, is Without Limits. But the music, I love the music of Chariots of Fire.
For sure. All right, next question. What is the best book you've read recently?
I actually read a lot. And I'm going to give you a biased answer. I have an identical twin brother who is a wonderful clinical psychologist, and he writes wonderful, wonderful books. And I think the most important book he wrote, it's about how to take care of your emotional hygiene. He's called Gil Winch. And, every kid comes back from school with a cut. He'll know to put a plaster on it. But when your kid comes back from school after failing at something or being rejected, most parents and the kids don't know what to do with that. But psychology does, and my brother tries to make that knowledge available to people so they can take those little cuts and bruises, psychological ones of our life, and treat them so they don't develop into something worse. And I think it's a very important book for people and for families and for parents.
For sure. All right, next question. What is your favorite thing about the work that you do?
We have had 5 couples meet and marry in the call center, not always someone with a disability, but someone with disability. And those weddings I'm such an emotional mess. I am such an emotional mess because they are, just to see the dance floor, you have a heart attack with some of the people who really shouldn't be dancing, but it's such a wonderful thing. So that would have to be it.
I think that's the best answer we've ever gotten to that question. All right, next question. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I think it was follow your heart and really do what you believe in, and everything else will come to its place. And that's what I do. I follow my heart and I do what I passionately believe in, and I'm leading a wonderful life.
Perfect. All right, last question. Who or what inspires you?
I work with people who have had such horrific lives, some of them. To see what they do with their lives, how they put meaning into their lives, how they bring happiness into their lives, their bravery. It's such an inspiring thing. It's such a wonderful, wonderful thing. And it makes everyone around them feel so lucky and privileged.
Love that. Gil, thank you so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR.
It was my pleasure, Jennifer. Thank you so much for having me.
I also want to thank our listeners. Here's a final reminder to unlock your access to the companion for this episode at iriconsultants.com/podcast. If you're ready for your Project HR debut, our team is always looking for outstanding guests. Send us an email to let us know about your expertise at projecthr@iriconsultants.com. And remember, we're now posting a new show every other week, so don't forget to subscribe to Project HR to keep up. Finally, drop me a line, leave us a review, or give the show a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's all for this week's episode of Project HR. Let's make it a great day at work.